Good morning, everybody. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Is that all right? The overall goal of today's presentation is to do a few things. We'll talk about vulnerability assessments, but I specifically wanted to talk about how they're different than penetration tests. We'll take a look at some specific tool sets and it's been touched on a couple of times in other presentations today about leveraging free and publicly available tool sets to leverage hacks. I wanted to go through some of those tool sets and actually simulate a real-world cyber attack from the standpoint of a motivated individual or group of people. And then we'll conclude with where we may be going, some additional considerations, and maybe the future of security. And based on the presentations that I've heard today, and I've been kind of gauging the technical level of the audience, and I'll tweak my material accordingly. And I want to gauge the audience just briefly. I have a question for everyone today, just by show of hands. How many of you, just by show of hands, know what an SQL injection attack is? That's quite a few of you. MD5, just by show of hands, what that is. Okay. So I don't want to talk down to anybody today. I don't want you to perceive that. I don't want to shoot over anybody's head to make the presentation pretty unproductive. I want to get it kind of a gauged perspective of where everybody's at. Vulnerability assessments, by definition, are just where we take a tool set that's pretty smart, and it has written into its programming logic a bunch of vulnerabilities that say, hey, we're going to find a target, whatever that target is. We talked about SCADA systems today. We've talked about, and it might be a target like a website, might be a group of IP addresses, might be publicly accessible IP addresses, might be internal IP addresses. Either way, we're taking a very smart piece of software that has written into its logic a bunch of vulnerabilities potentially that can be identified. So we'll put in that target name, we'll tell it to go, and it will go to a website, for example, if that's our target, find all the vulnerabilities, come back in just a matter of an hour or two and tell us where those vulnerabilities are at. And it's very, very smart that way. It's smart software. It can do in a matter of minutes what would take us hours to verify manually. And so in a nutshell, that's vulnerability scanning using software, but it's much deeper than that. I mean, a vulnerability assessment involves a lot of auditor judgment. When you walk into an environment and take a tool set that you might use at, say, a bank and put it into the organization here, it's not going to be a one-to-one. You're going to have to really understand the overall infrastructure, understand how to tweak policies, this vulnerability scanning tool set, et cetera, to leverage that software to truly give an organization like this a really good test. So too, on the penetration testing side, comparing vulnerability assessments to penetration testing, vulnerability assessments take a really smart piece of software. Here's our target. Tell us our issues. Do it in a way that does it quickly. Do it in a way that we can break it down in terms of English and we can generate a report that we can identify vulnerabilities. That's what it does. Pen testing, slightly different. We'll do the exact same thing. We'll go and we'll scan, for example, for vulnerabilities, as was mentioned by Mr. Adams, on the perimeter side, the internal side, whatever the target is. Might be a web application. Tell us where these issues are. Do it quickly, do it efficiently, do it as accurately as you can. Give us a report that's reasonably efficient and accurate that we can read and understand. Then if we see a vulnerability, for example, an SQL injection vulnerability as an example, pen testers will then leverage that identified vulnerability in an attempt to exploit the system. And hence the difference between a pen test and a vulnerability assessment. And just to walk through, I think, a really good example of the difference between the value in a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test would be something real simple as this. We talked about vulnerability assessments not only leveraging a really good tool set like Nessus or Rapid7 or Qualys or whatever tool set we use to tell us where our issues are at, but we also evaluate the environment. And as an auditor or someone coming in and giving an organization a fresh pair of eyes, I can envision a scenario like this to where we do a vulnerability assessment, but also to kind of explain the difference between it and a pen test. Let's say we're auditing an organization and we walk in and look at the local computer system. We go in and we may have a checklist that we're looking at for possible vulnerabilities. We notice that they're running Windows 7 Professional, and then we look at the local user rights on that machine. And we happen to identify that they're not just standard users on the computer, where standard users can't do certain things on a machine. They can't go in and change local security policy, they can't override policy, they can't access certain areas of the machine. Instead, they're local administrators of the machine. And there's a certain element of risk to that. And from a vulnerability assessment point of view, we would have our first audit exception. We would say users should not have, for example, local administrator rights, they can bypass security controls, et cetera. So from an auditor perspective, we have a checklist. There's our first audit exception. We also noticed that in the vulnerability assessment that users can go about anywhere on the internet. We have very little filtering from the end user to the internet. So they can go just about anywhere. They can access social media websites. They can access potentially malicious websites. Very little filtering to the internet. Audit exception 2. We noticed the third thing here that we might ask the user, let's visit ABC website. Let's just see, let's say they're using Internet Explorer as an example. They go to a website and we have an executable file up there. We just want to see how the browser handles that. So the end user can click that hyperlink embedded in the browser to run an exe file. 3 individual audit exceptions in a vulnerability assessment. Let's talk about how that compares to a pen test. We've kind of set it up in previous presentations, especially with the Homeland Security presentation, which was very well done on the pen testing side. So let's simulate a pen test. We start from the outside in. We have a key contact of the organization and a domain name. That's it. We then say we data mine. We can even use the Kali tool set that was referenced earlier. There's a good data miner in there called Maltego. So we can just go in and open up Kali. We can go to data.com, which is a free service. Type in Southwest Power Pool, type in Bank of America, type in IBM. IBM gives you 56,000 employees, for example. Bank of America would give you about 10,500. So you can quickly get employee names. That's valuable if you're a pen tester. So now let's put in first initial, last name, and let's spoof an email into the organization. We spoofed the email into the organization. We were able to bypass spam filtering. It gets to the end user. The end user sees the email. Then they click a link embedded in the email. When they click that link, based on our vulnerability audit, we know they're going to get there because they have very limited filtering to the internet. But not only that, we had a little lander page that said, will you please enter your, say, email, username, and password in order to access this web page. Kind of trick them a little bit. No matter what they put in there, it then loads another page that says missing plugin. Like, ooh, I want to access this web page. So they click the missing plugin link, and the next thing you know, the hackers have remote access to the computer. But think about the value in that from an audit perspective. You now know that you got to have some employee training in place. Our personal human firewall failed the test big time. We were able to bypass spam filtering controls. Our program, the EXE, was able to run on the local machine because the end user had local administrator rights. That's another audit exception in general. We drove the risk home to the organization. Not only that, we can also simultaneously test network segregation. So we gained access to this machine, which simultaneously gave us, for example, in a VNC session, we've got remote access to their network shares, and we can enumerate their network, drop a keylogger, do whatever we want to do at that time. But the point is, how separated is this network? So once we get on this machine, can we see the other sensitive data? As was alluded to by the Homeland Security presentation, can we see the SCADA systems? We have a prime example here. We gained remote access to a publicly interfacing computer that's capable of accessing the internet. Our other systems should be logically separated, firewalled, et cetera. So certainly our pen tests tell us so much more about an organization's overall security posture than a vulnerability scan, although both are very good due diligence. As was also mentioned earlier in the previous presentation, I was wondering how much of it was going to be talked about before I got up here today. But we talked about an internal approach to vulnerability assessments and penetration testing, as well as an external approach to pen testing. Generally speaking, depending upon the engagement type, we might hire an organization or have Homeland Security come in and look at the organization from the inside out. And we're asking the question, what's the probability of something or someone doing something they shouldn't on the internal network, based on the current security configuration? That is the ultimate question that we're answering here. We'll identify devices, identify and footprint, enumerate services. We can also take these smart pieces of software that we talked about, like Qualys or Nessus or Rapid7 or just whatever the software package is, put in some credentials, domain credentials or whatever, have it enumerate the entire network and tell us the status of our patch management system. Also inventory the network, etc. All very valuable security due diligence. Was that me? Sorry. So all really good security due diligence. Again, patch management, we can also simultaneously detect network segregation issues, test our SCADA systems. SCADA systems are interesting. We don't, as a company, test a lot of SCADA systems simply because we don't personally see the demand for it. There are companies out there that really work hard to craft exploits for SCADA systems, and those of you might remember in 2013, do you remember the water utility that the U.S. government created as a honeypot on the internet? See some people shaking your heads, but it took less, I think it was 2 days, if I remember, it might have been quicker, for the Chinese to completely own the SCADA systems on the internet. 50% of the traffic that came and exploited this bogus honeypot water system was from China. I think we had some from the Ukraine, France. Most of it was international traffic. Point is, they're attacking SCADA systems. There are ethical hacking companies out there that do this kind of work. And one of them specifically that comes to mind is Immunity out of Florida. They write a lot of memory corruption code, have a lot of gifted programmers that do a lot of overflow and corruption stuff, and they focus on SCADA systems. We have one of their packages called Canvas, Immunity Canvas. And as part of that, you'll get a monthly update with the newest SCADA exploit. And it'll come down and you can see it and see what they've written. Most of it all is written in Python, which is awesome. Really great scripting language. It's a really good market out there for SCADA exploitation. External assessments, pardon me. I had to put that mic up a little high because of my voice. External assessments test from the outside in, as we talked about, simulating a real-world cyber attack from the internet into the organization. That's 99% of my work, is we have very minimal information from the outside. Doesn't matter if it's a bank, a government organization, any organization with intellectual property, sensitive, personal, identifiable data like Social Security numbers they want protected, whatever it might be. They want to simulate a real-world attack, as was alluded to by Mr. Adams earlier, using tool sets that are leveraged by hackers. So we leverage those tool sets and simulate real-world attacks from the internet. Has anyone in the room heard of a relatively famous hacker by the name of the Jester? Anybody? The hacktivist, former apparently military professional. He was the one who defaced WikiLeaks when WikiLeaks was releasing a lot of their information initially. He gets mad every now and then at a particular organization or group and goes through and attempts to hack them. And nicely enough, he displays what he's doing real time on his Twitter feed. So the Showdown HQ website was mentioned earlier. He leverages that pretty regularly to identify email servers, for example, or other services. Next thing you know, you see 2 or 3 more posts, and then the website is down. So leveraging tool sets from the outside in is a very common approach by pen testing companies as well as by the bad guys. We are simultaneously testing intrusion detection systems to identify if our scan traffic is identified real time, or if we have intrusion prevention systems as well. We start scanning the perimeter network. We start scanning. Our scans are immediately shut down. The next time we scan, the host appears dead. An intrusion prevention type approach rather than just an intrusion detection approach. So too on the internal network. Over the last couple of weeks, I have been reviewed. This is an unfortunate reality of my job, but I reviewed about 1,010 log files on a breach. And going through those log files, trying to find evidence of a particular breach was extremely tedious because this particular organization did not have a true intrusion detection, intrusion prevention that would parse and break all of that down. It can be a real headache, especially post-breach, if you end up getting hit and have to prove or disprove that some sensitive data was taken. what was a 15-hour job should have been 2 or 3 minutes with an IPS system or an IDS system, for example. Like Splunk, like a log management type system would be really good in a system like that. I think the overall assessment, regardless of who does the assessment, is generally predicated on 3 primary things. One, the tool set matters. There are security professionals out there that will say it doesn't, but I think it really does matter. You've got to have a good leveraging tool set, vulnerability scanner for due diligence, and also leveraging the free or open source stuff. The tools which the bad guys use are critical to use during a penetration test. You want your test, if it is a pen test, to truly simulate a real-world attack. If you get a vulnerability assessment, certainly we want the vulnerability assessment to leverage a tool set that's one of the best in the market. The overall talent of the people that are doing the engagement is very, very important as well. The good old-fashioned resume checking, good old-fashioned reference checking, maybe even sitting them down and getting them as part of an information technology committee and pop them with questions from 10 different directions is very important to see who you've got working on this engagement and getting the most bang for the buck. And then how the organizations work together before the audit or pen test to determine scope, like for example excluding the CADA systems as was alluded earlier. You take a private firm that comes in here and does an audit in this industry, it could get really bad really quick unless there were some very firm ground rules in the initial inception of the engagement. Also post-engagement, everyone being there to work together to help remedy audit exceptions. And that's one good thing about really good, generally speaking, tool sets, the enterprise class ones, is that when issues are found, they can save both the third-party company and the organization receiving the audit a lot of time because there's information on remediation. So it tells you how to fix them, where to find information on all this stuff. And I thought we would spend just a little bit of time talking about some tool sets on an enterprise level, which is, I'm kind of glad that we just happened to get lucky and put enterprise class software in here because the other presentations that we've listened to have done a really good job of looking at some of the freer stuff like Nmap in Kali, which we love Nmap. But these will look at it from the other side of the coin, the enterprise class software that you as an organization can buy and lease or you could get from, possibly use from a third-party company. One of the tool sets that has been in our repertoire for about where Bruce was at, but probably 14 years, probably from the inception of when we started doing network security and pen testing in our company, is Qualys. Anyone heard of Qualys here? Really good tool set, we think, especially on the perimeter side. One of the biggest issues that you can run into in security testing are false positives, where you take a tool set, it scans and comes back and tells you you have 15 issues, and you've got to whittle down the ones that aren't real issues, that they just posted false positives. Qualys has a very low false positive rate. One of the issues we've seen with it, though, over the years, and we've dealt with it a lot over the years, is they have a pay per IP model. So each time you scan an IP, it takes an IP away from your account, and you've got to continually buy more. That is not the case with the third bullet point, which is Nessus. Most all of us here have probably heard of Nessus. It was mentioned as well in a presentation earlier. Rapid7, Nessus, and Nexpose. Rapid7 and Nexpose are actually part of the same company. Rapid7 has a pretty amazing vulnerability scanner, but it's very, very pricey. I noted pay per IP model. It's actually a pay per block of IP model, which we'll look at just briefly. Nessus is about a $1,500 piece of software for one license. You can scan an infinite number of IP addresses. Problem we've run into and continue to run into are false positives. Anyone in here use Nessus by chance? I was at a multi-billion-dollar financial institution about 3 weeks ago, ran Nessus on the internal network, and it said there were 4 Windows 2000 computers on the network as an example. It was the only scanner that I had that said that. Turns out they weren't 2000, they were 2008. And Nexpose, just briefly, the Rapid7 company has an enterprise class scanning system that lets you scan an infinite number of IP addresses for a kind of an annual cost, which is a pretty amazing package. It's just very pricey, up to around the $10,000 to $15,000 range for the consultant license. They just for everyone's note, they have a new version. It's kind of a scaled down version. They're selling for about 3 to 5 now, but still in the grand scheme of things is pricey. A quick glance at the Qualys interface. We'll see that it's very, generally speaking, pretty user-friendly. Qualys will track scan data, archive reports, give you remediation. You can set up individual users. It will span the entire Qualys community and tell you what the top 10 vulnerabilities are at all time. And there is also an extensive repository or knowledge base of information. Rather than just hitting Google, doing some searches, finding out what this particular report does, if it's a false positive, et cetera, Qualys does a really great job of telling you, for example, why there isn't a cross-site script vulnerability in Outlook web access. That's a false positive, whereas Nessus doesn't really seem to know that. So again, kind of to encapsulate the Qualys tool set, it's a little pricey. Each time you hit a live IP address, it'll cost you about $2, which is pretty expensive, especially if you did it on the internal network. Detailed reporting, remediation tracking. You'll find resolution strategies for most audit exceptions. A couple of issues. I know generally speaking, I'm very much anti-cloud. There's probably a lot of you who are similar. It's very convenient, but there are some issues with that. Qualys has a lot of data stored in the cloud, and that's an issue. Whenever you do your scans, it stores permanently there, and your username and password phish or compromise away from losing that data. Again, they're pay per IP model. Wanted to briefly just share with you the Nexpose tool set. Just by show of hands, has anyone used this tool set before? Very nice. The free community edition or the enterprise? Do you know how much it ran you? Not sure. Nexpose is a really nice tool set. It is not a pay per IP per se. It's a pay for a block of IPs. If you want to be able to scan, say, 1,000, it's going to cost you a lot more than if you wanted to only be able to scan 256 at a time, for example. I've leveraged this tool set a lot over the years and have become very fond of it. Very low false positive rates, detailed reporting, and what I like a lot about it is this right here. It comes with some really thorough policy scans that are built into the software. You can do a full audit, which is a typical due diligence audit, looking for things such as missing patches and just overall due diligence. But you can simulate a denial of service attack as well. And not to say it's the best, we're not always doing that, but you at least have the option to do it. We can do a penetration test. To give you an example of where I recently saw this software work very well using the pen test template is Dell remote access controllers. The default username and password is root and Calvin. Now, of course, we could all Google that and say, what is the default username for a Dell remote access controller, root Calvin? But this software is smart enough to know that. So if you put it in the pen test policy template, hit go to Dell remote access controller, it will test that for you and then fire back the results, either yes, it was default or no, it was not. Really impressive piece of software. The reporting is really, really good. The price is probably one of the biggest issues. I have brought an enterprise network down running this software. It actually brought down a Cisco router. The Cisco router, interestingly enough, was configured Cisco, and admin no pass, so there were some issues with it. It was old software, and there were some other issues, but to make a long story short, it did cause a denial of service situation for at least one of our clients in the past. So we're very self-conscious of doing a full, for example, subnet scan block with this tool set. And again, as was mentioned earlier, there's kind of a trend today that we're seeing with free tool sets on the internet, and kind of piggybacking on what was mentioned earlier about this, I think there's 2 or 3 very concerning trends that we're seeing today in the world that is relevant for today's discussion on pen testing and cybersecurity. One is that we have unprecedented access to free tool sets on the internet to do hacking. That's number one. Number two is we have unprecedented access to hide our tracks on the internet. And then a third thing that's not mentioned in the slides that I think is also equally unprecedented is that we have a lot of collective intelligence in the world today. You have anonymous, you have hacktivist groups that are all over the place, you have organized crime rings. Organized crime rings in Russia are by far the number one thing that I see in hacking financial institutions. You talked about, someone had mentioned earlier about the wire transfers, Mr. Adams, I believe. The wire transfers that we see, most all of them, after an organization has been hacked on the ACH origination side to the Ukraine using Western Union. Their tool sets are amazing. Generally speaking, they're very sophisticated. They're not out of the box. But how they're getting there and some of the other tool sets that they're using to especially hide their tracks are pretty much over the counter. So hacktivist groups and organized crime rings, a whole bunch of minds coming together for a common cause, and that cause might be to hack ABC organizations such as, just as an example, those of you who might remember this, the H.B. Gary hack with Aaron Barr would be a prime example of collective intelligence, leveraging free tool sets and social engineering. Talking about this just briefly, we have tool sets to do about everything inside just the Kali tool set that was mentioned earlier. It's a Swiss Army knife of hacking. There's tool sets in there to exploit websites, a bunch of them. SQL map comes to mind. I saw that. Remember the 1,010 log files I mentioned? There was evidence of SQL map there as well as Havage to do a successful SQL injection breach, for example. Identifying vulnerabilities, a bunch of tools for that. OpenVOS and Kali is really good at that. You can scan a ton of IP addresses for free rather than leveraging the enterprise tool sets we talked about. Those are just there for you to use. Data mining, Maltego is an amazing tool set for that. You can put in a domain, right-click, run transform set. Next thing you know, you go to lunch, come back, you've got email addresses, phone numbers, cross-reference web URLs, you name it. So these tool sets are very easily publicly available for the bad guys to use today. And also hacking wireless networks. We've got Airmon, Fern, other stuff inside the Kali distribution. In addition, for $150, anyone ever heard of Pineapple? The Pineapple wireless hacking tool set. See some heads again. $150. It's a one. If you're really wanting to hack wireless, there's your investment. DNS spoofing, man-in-the-middle attacks, defeating actually SSL on the fly due to your fact you're man-in-the-middle. It's a really, really bad, nasty product that's being leveraged by the attackers to defeat wireless, including, well, basically just leveraging man-in-the-middle to defeat SSL. How are we hiding ourselves? Generally, the bad guys are using the Onion network, as alluded to earlier. That's Tor, which is noted here. Tor goes the extra mile to not retain log data, which isn't good for us, but really good for the bad guys. ProXPN also has a limited log retention policy. So you can see why the hackers have vested interest in, for example, rather than coming from their home IP address, they just route through an Onion network. The 1,010 log files I looked at had a bunch of traffic from Tor as well. If you look up the IP address, it'll say Tor exit node in Aaron. Interestingly enough, in one particular hack, it was Tor exit node, Tor exit node, Tor exit node, Tor exit node, then an IP address of a university. Tor exit node, Tor exit node, Tor exit node, IP address of a university. They did not cover adequately. So you have to be really diligent to ensure that you cover your tracks, or the bad guys have to, otherwise they'll leave a pretty hefty trail, something to cross-reference to. The FBI was able to cross-reference one of the university IP addresses to a known kind of organized crime hack, which they're currently investigating. So ProXPN, a software to hide ourselves, to kind of onion through the network with the Tor side, and then also free tool sets to leverage access. And what I thought we would do is just walk through just an example, a real-world example of leveraging nothing but free tool sets. And in deference to especially the technical folks in the audience, there's nothing at all in the next 5 slides that are just rocket science. I mean, this is stuff that is just really over-the-counter stuff, push button and go and see what we can do. And the tool set that was leveraged for this, if you go to YouTube and type in Havage SQL injection, one of the first videos of this was a 5-year-old whose dad was showing him how to do an SQL injection attack. So to give you an example, we were talking about flipping through the iPhone earlier. Imagine a 5-year-old saying, okay, copy this web address, paste this web address, and hit go. And that's the extent of what we're looking at in these next few slides here. So what we're seeing is we're seeing the bad guys run, for example, Tor. We'll see our onion there. It's just a download from the Tor network, the Tor onion. The IP address in this case posted 87.106, which means we're popping out of Germany, even though we might be here in Little Rock. Digitally, it looks like we're coming out of Germany. It's a very common approach by the bad guys. Another common approach is to leverage Google. Google is a really great place to harvest specific web addresses and types of data. In this case, we just typed in news.php ID equals because we're looking for evidence of database integration and a database serving information to the internet. If you look down here, we have some examples where we have the Arab America, and at the very end it says .php and it has a question mark ID equals. If you're really into this type of thing, into web application hacking, you would know that you can take the after whatever's in that equal and you can put something else and just see what happens. So we did that, and if you put an apostrophe up here, you might see the little apostrophe there. We get an error in the application. What we should get is nothing. So just a quick test, 5-second test, right? Put the apostrophe, enter, what happens? We got an application error. Okay, we got an application error, that's interesting. Now comes the 5-year-old copying and pasting the URL into the application and hits go. And then what that application does is it comes back and says, well, your database name is, and by the way, there are 14 fields populating on this website. Just by clicking go. The second thing they're able to do is say, okay, give me all your tables. It's just another button click, right? So if you look down at the tables, we've got 27 tables behind the scenes. This is what used to have to be done, I would say, pre-2006. SQL Map is an automated tool set that's used to do SQL injection testing. It was developed in 2006. Prior to that, you had to be pretty crafty and write a lot of these in yourself. You go up to the URL and type in order by 10 or account, table name, etc. You'd type all of that in. With these tool sets, it just does it automatically. And that's what was done to, in turn, populate all the table names. You might notice the last table here is users. We'll hit next, and now we're going to populate all the fields of the users table. Notice we have a user ID and password here. And again, this is 5 clicks of an application that's over the counter. So now we've got our username and password. Oh, it turns out that the username is in the clear, but they were good. They did some good due diligence. They hashed the password. So the password, there was no disclosure there. But fortunately, the free internet and access to tool availability comes into play again. We take the password hash, and we don't know what it is, but we can sort of guess. Those of you who would look at that would probably know it's probably weak and probably MD5, and it turns out that's what it is. So if you copy and paste it into an application like crackstation.net, which is mentioned here, or any other application that's designed to take this hash, this password hash, copy and paste it and see where it gets you, and it'll tell you that is in fact MD5, and it will tell you that the password's Serena and the password's password. Of course, it would have been a lot less work just type in password. But the point being, over-the-counter free tool sets can lead to not only... Now, keep in mind that in this case, we extracted table data, extracted a user ID, a password, decrypted the password, all with free over-the-counter tool sets. This website was vulnerable to the extent that you could also, rather than doing this, you could write drop commands, for example, and actually destroy data. And that's why it's very important for us to do due diligence on these web applications and our entire infrastructure to make sure that we're not vulnerable to either defacement, being brought down, vulnerable to compromise, and the disclosure of sensitive information. It was also mentioned earlier that vulnerability assessments and pen testing are only valid for a certain period of time. Certainly as evidenced by the fact that the second Tuesday being Patch Tuesday. In the industry, it's very commonly known that Wednesday is known as Exploit Wednesday. So what didn't get patched on Tuesday, just the next day everything starts ticking right along. That was one of the concerns with Windows XP, was that a lot of people we're going to hold on to zero-day vulnerabilities until after the end of deadline, whenever XP just went away and stopped deploying patches to fix the operating system. If you found a vulnerability that would work and exploit Windows XP, why disclose it if you're a bad guy? Just sit on it, let the last Patch Tuesday roll around, then it would be good forever. It turns out one of the O days was leaked, and Microsoft said it was bad enough, we'll go ahead and fix it anyway. But it will be very interesting to see down the road how that plays out. So talking about security today and where we might go in the future with some additional considerations and even some good security due diligence today, and what we're seeing, especially in the federal government, is software like Bit9 Parity, Tripwire, and Firemon. And for purposes of our time element today, we'll spend most of our time talking about Bit9 Parity. But it seems to me that if we could just shoot ourselves into the future about 5 or 10 years, what I would envision would be our end users having significantly less control over whatever it is that they're on. That'll probably happen. I mean, it just makes sense that, like, for example, your iPhone, Apple does so much to protect you from you. They'll only allow certain types of code to run on it. You can only access certain things unless you jailbreak it. Apple's really driving that piece. So too in software as a service in the cloud. If you access, say, a Windows computer in an Amazon cloud environment, you can configure that entire cloud access to only be able to serve ABC permissions to the end users. The point being, we have a central machine that goes out and manages the security of our end users. End users don't understand it usually. They don't want to be bothered with it. They just want to be secure. And under those conditions, I think that's the trend that we'll see down the road in terms of security. One of the bridges to that time is software like Bit9 Parity. And just a show of hands, has anyone in here used Bit9 Parity? Anyone? Wonderful. Bit9's an amazing tool set that is designed to proactively monitor files, folders, services, etc., such that if any of that changes, it either stops it, doesn't let it run, or lets someone who's the administrator of the Bit9 system let it run. The government's invested, I think year before last, was something like $6 million into this software. And what they did was a study. They took the Bit9 software and they took antivirus software and put them into the same network, and they just let them run. And in each case, Bit9 was able to immediately, thwart the attack, whereas nothing else was. So again, software that sits on a system that helps make the client computer secure. So if a virus gets on it and tries to access System 32, for example, modify a system file, it can't do it unless the policy server, the central server at Bit9 allows it, and there's an administrator that handles all of that. So an amazing tool set that may likely bridge the gap. Bit9 has a kind of an informal marketing campaign about they don't, with their system, you don't need antivirus. And there are a lot of security professionals who question the value of antivirus because of its various reasons, but Bit9 is really trying to bridge that gap. So kind of summarizing what we've talked about so far and moving toward big picture management oversight, we've talked about packages which are really good due diligence to go through and provide an overview of open ports, services, etc. We have not talked about areas like what can jump up and bite an organization in terms of licensing compliance, for example, and tools that can be used to quickly identify remote access into a network, for example. We had just say it's a financial institution, about 8 years ago, where a disgruntled network administrator called the SPA on them and said that their software licensing was not compliant, and the Software Piracy of America organization went and basically audited the organization and fined them $225,000. And they ended up settling. It was a real weird situation. They ended up hiring that guy as well. I don't know what that says, but I guess they thought he was a really good sales rep. Very important to do due diligence to ensure that we're operating in a compliant environment software-wise as well. couple of tool sets to think about. One is the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. Not sure in here who's used that, but it's a really good assessment tool to look and say, here's our infrastructure now. We're interested in taking all of our 50 thick servers that we have here, and we're going to virtualize them. Here's what it's going to take to get there. Really good tool set for that from a licensing perspective, as well as even a hardware services perspective. And the IMCO network software scanner, I've used this in combination with tool sets like SpiceWorks before to scrub a network and look for things like, I'll tell you where it gets real valuable. In the last couple of months, we've had key IT people leave an organization that the organization was worried that that person still had remote access into the bank somehow. They had killed their VPN access, but they might have had a transparent VPN access somehow, maybe a log-me-in access or something like that. IMCO is really, really good, and SpiceWorks at going through and saying, just tell me where my VNC installations are. Tell me where my log-me-in installations are. Of course, we've got all that blocked at the firewall, or we try to ensure all that's blocked at the firewall first off. But if it's not, and it's a necessity, important to use these kinds of software packages to ensure that they're not residing on the network. So I know we have about 5 or so minutes left, and to summarize what we've spoken about, for sure, pen testing starts, I think, a true cybersecurity pen test starts from the outside in, minimal information. I think a domain and primary contact is more than sufficient. We'll find the IP addresses, we'll find the targets. Up front, we'll decide what's not to be tested. Once we agree on scope and we move forward, we'll enumerate, we'll test gateway routers, firewalls. Whoever the security company is doing the due diligence should ensure that their testing includes all devices. The company we talked about, Bit9 Parity, sounds like an ideal system that would be very difficult to hack, but those of you who remember, they were hacked last year, beginning of last year. They had some low-hanging fruit. They had one server in their network that didn't have the software. We might have one router. We might have one firewall. We might have one computer. But where's that low-hanging fruit? That's the purpose of these pen tests, to find those kinds of things. And also looking at the internal network, how remote access is accomplished, vendor due diligence, even the physical security considerations that was talked about earlier as well. We firmly believe in doing action item tracking, having management oversight, getting the information documented, ensuring a timely resolution of audit exceptions. I work in generally a highly regulated financial environment. It's where I spend most of my time. They're very regulated by the FDIC, the OCC, Federal Reserve, and others. And they're required to have a lot of the same due diligence that you guys do in terms of policies. You guys are ramped up a little bit with your overly, very, very critical SCADA type systems. Again, kind of concluding all of this, to continually stay engaged, hit the forums, do due diligence on security. Remember, it's a changing environment, a very dynamic, moving target, and we believe on a couple of principles: continuous threat monitoring, if you can afford it, true intrusion detection prevention, and persistent, independent third-party auditing are some really, really good due diligence to consider. Any questions?
I remember one of my first projects as an engineer that I designed. I went to my microfiche reader and printer, downloaded my Corps of Engineers spec on that, and printed it off, marked it up with a pen, handed it to someone, and typed it up on the typewriter. So I guess my question, I've seen just an amazing, in the past 30 years, what's gone on with computers, where we got to today. So my question is, where are we going to? And are you seeing more private networks like we've got at nuclear plants, where there's a physical separation? In a nuke plant, all the computers on the inside never interface with anything on the outside.
And that's a really good question. And to paraphrase, it's where are we going and what the future of security might hold in general. And I definitely think we'll see significantly more network segregation like you're talking about. Why in the world would an end user need to access the internet and get email on the same computer that can access a SCADA system? Why in the world would we need that? In fact, in Europe, it's illegal to have a financial institution have your core data, which is all your PID data, account number, social security number, all that stuff, on network A, and have another computer on network A access the internet. They've got to be physically separate. So I think that network segregation is the future, but also restricting what end users can do from a security standpoint at the endpoint level will be number 2. It's just coming. It just seems like it just feels like it's coming. That Apple infrastructure of where you can't do this on your Apple device is a prime example. The centralized model, the centralized app store, the centralized policy distribution. You don't have that in Android. You got a distributed app store, big issue. A lot of viruses, a lot of issues. They also allow a lot of miscellaneous code to run on the box that you don't have on Apple. Not to say Apple's really the future, but it seems as though their model is conducive to a more secure future, and I think we might move that way.
How do you see IP version 6 and network neutrality fitting into this industry, or how's it going to affect this?
And the question was how IPv6 and net neutrality falls into things. I'm fascinated by the fact that IPv6 isn't rolled out more widely than it is. And it still appears to be vendor compatibility. I'm fascinated by that. I mean, we were hearing about IP exhaustion and IPv4 7 years ago. And here we are because of, in fact, IPv6 will play a role for sure. It's definitely a much more secure approach. But to tell you how big of a problem it is in the industry to get there, Verizon has started actually issuing private IP addresses to some of their non-business customers. You may have noticed that. So if you're on the Verizon network and you look at your IP address assigned to your phone, you will see a private IP address. So they're even finding ways to preserve the IPv4 scheme as much as possible. Regarding net neutrality, I know that's still in the news and it's a big baby. I don't believe that. Thought this through quite a bit, but I don't. The internet was made and originally at least built for equal access to the internet. And the thought of, say, just hypothetically, Google having a vested interest to throttle your traffic whenever it goes to a competitor and allow full traffic to their servers, in other words, to encourage you to use a Google service or encourage you to use Netflix, or how people can buy their way into faster speeds, just isn't the spirit of the internet. It seems to me the spirit of the internet was to allow equal access to all. And 2 or 3 years ago, I guess I felt about net neutrality, it didn't have a chance. And I was on the bandwagon with Al Franken getting on front of Congress and talking about net neutrality and why it was a necessity and we have to keep net neutrality. Now I don't know. I really don't know where we're going with that. If I had to guess, I would say that big businesses are going to somehow find a way to win. It's what it looks like to me now. I'm not as optimistic as I was about 5 or 7 years ago. But hopefully net neutrality remains. We have equal access to the internet, and I envision maybe at some point in the future we will exhaust our entire IPv4 and we'll move on if vendors can find a way to incorporate it effectively. But it's a much more secure operating scheme for sure.
All right. Don't see any more hands, so Terry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's